Hello guys, and welcome back to another episode of Paint by Minis. As always, my name is Adam, and today I've got a really fun, quick and easy tutorial for you, and it's to do with painting grots. Now, the goal of the tutorial is to get a single grot painted up in under an hour and looking to a pretty high quality tabletop standard. To do this, we're going to use a few hobby hacks such as a Zenithal priming, contrast paints, and the secret ingredient, an oil wash. Now, there may be a few things there that you think are pretty advanced techniques, but trust me, this is a completely beginner friendly guide, and if there's any steps along the way that require specific equipment, I will give you full alternatives to achieve a pretty similar result. Right, enough waffling, let's get painting. So we're using what I would consider a pretty limited palette. We're only using 4 acrylic paints, 2 inks, and if you're using an airbrush you'll be using a white ink as well, so that's a 3rd ink. I'll go through all the colours individually as and when they're used within the tutorial, so don't worry too much about jotting down the names. And lastly, we are using 1 oil paint this time. It's just a standard black, and trust me, you do not need to get a tube this big. It was just on sale at the time. This will last me a lifetime, I imagine. So off camera I've just primed the mini black, and then the first real step is going to be using this white ink to do a Zenithal highlight from the very top of the model. If you've never heard of Zenithal highlighting before, all we're doing is replicating a light source from above or whatever direction you want, but in this case we're using above. And to replicate the light source we're just going to shoot a very light colour, so in this instance we're using white over black, and this will help us show where the highlights and the shadows will be quite naturally. So if you don't have an airbrush, don't worry at all, you can still achieve the same effect by using just Rattlecam primers. Just prime black as I've already done and then shoot with a white primer from the top. So now that the Zenithal priming's done, we can move on to the first colour, and that's going to be Griff Charger Grey, which is a contrast paint, and we're going to use this for the cloak. So even though this is a contrast paint, you don't want to apply this too thickly. The idea is that we're using contrast because they're semi-transparent paints, so we can take advantage of the Zenithal highlight that we've already done and retain the highlights and shadows and just use the contrast paint to tint it a specific colour. We're going to do 2 layers of this, so just keep them quite thin. So this is what we're looking like after 1 layer. I've just let it dry completely. So now we can move on to the second layer, and again just apply this very thinly. It's more of a glaze than an actual globby paint job that you'd usually do with a contrast. But now with the second coat we should really be building up a decent coverage and colour, but still retaining that highlight and shadow from the Zenithal highlight. Also, I forgot to mention, but we are also going to fill in any of the voids in the shield in between the moon symbol with the same colour. You want to do 2 layers of this as well. This one you can put on quite thickly because we do want it to be a bit darker, so don't worry about really globbing it in there and letting it pool up. That is as long as you keep it away from the white of the moon. We want to keep that intact. So for our second and last contrast paint we are going to use Plaguebearer Flesh, and as the name suggests, this is going on all of the exposed flesh on the model. Very similar to the first contrast paint, we're just going to do a nice even layer. Don't apply it too thickly, we want to still be able to see the highlights and shadows same as before. With the contrast paint steps done, we are now moving on to opaque paint, and the first paint that we're going to use is this Metal and Alchemy colour. It's Heavy Metal by Scale Colour. You want to use this for all the metal areas. So I'm painting his sword and the rim of the shield. It's quite a bright silver colour, so if you don't have this colour in particular, just go for the brightest silver that you've got. We want to create a bit of contrast against the dark robes. This is quite a thin colour, so we're going to need to do 2 or 3 coats of this just to build it up. The second and last opaque colour for now is Pallid Witch Flesh, and we're just going to use these to pick out the teeth and eyes. This depends on the model of the goblin that you're doing, as some of them don't really have well defined eyes or teeth, so if you're painting a particular one and you want to skip this step, that's absolutely fine. With the opaque colours done, we're going back now to some transparent colours, and we're going to use a couple of inks. The first of which is this Brilliant Yellow by Dale Rowney. We're going to use this to highlight the detail on the shield. This is a very thin layer, and just to really build up the vibrancy of the yellow, we're going to do a couple of thin coats. Just be extra careful not to get this on any of the blue robes, as it will turn them bright green. The second and final ink that we're going to use is this Burnt Umber ink, again by Dale Rowney, and with this we're just going to pick out the robe detailing and the handle of the weapons. It is quite a tight squeeze down in some of these areas, so if you'd rather leave it, that's absolutely fine. Just as a quick side note, if you don't have either of the inks, don't worry, you can use contrast paints in similar colours for all these steps. And here we are, this is what we're looking like at the moment. These are all of the steps completed now before we do any highlighting. If you like how it looks, you could just leave it as it is, but we're going to do a few extra steps to really pick out some details. So the first extra detail that we're going to do is picking out some highlights on the robes. For this you want to take the main colour that we used, which was Griff Charger Grey, and we're going to mix 2 parts of that into 1 part Pallid Witch Flesh. It should look around something like this on the palette. So to do the highlighting, we're actually going to use a new technique that I haven't shown off before, and it's called stippling. And all that we're doing is creating a lot of small dots and lines and scratches to show the texture of the cloth a bit more. It's also a much newer painter friendly technique because you're not required to do hard straight lines super thin. You can kind of be a bit looser and freer with it. So you want to just stipple this all over the very edges of the cloak and any raised areas that are a bit lighter from the Zenithal highlight that we did earlier. So now we've finished stippling highlighting the cloak, we're going to move on and do a similar thing on the face, as these two are the largest kind of features that draw the eye on the model. That's why we're spending a little bit extra time on them. But the colours we're going to use to stipple the face are again the Pallid Witch Flesh, and we're going back to what we used for the main colour of the skin, which is Plague Bearer Flesh, and we're just mixing these 1 to 1 this time on the palette, and they should look something like this. So once again, same stippling technique, and this time you're just going to pick out the top raised areas on the face and hands. Don't worry too much if they're looking a bit stark at the moment. The next step that we're going to do with the wash is going to tone all of this down. Hello guys, Adam here. Sorry for the interruption. As I was editing, I noticed that I had completely missed an alternate step if you didn't want to do an oil wash, and I very clearly said at the beginning of the video that if there are any steps that required specific materials, that I would provide an alternate for new people, just in case they didn't have all this stuff. So, sorry about that. If you don't have oil and you don't want to do an oil wash, I would recommend just doing a normal non-oil wash. I'm sure you probably have a pot of non-oil. It's just an acrylic wash. I would maybe recommend just thinning it a little bit with either Lahmian medium or water, and just go from there. It will probably look fine. Alright, enough of this, back to the video. Hand over to voiceover Adam. Thank you, goodbye. Mwah. So the next and final step is going to be the oil wash, and for this I'm just using this tube of Winsor & Newton Ivory Black. Now if you are in the market for an oil paint, I would definitely recommend this range by Winsor & Newton. It strikes a really good balance between affordability and quality. I would highly recommend it. You're also going to need some white spirit, preferably low odour, just for the working environment, and if you're working with anyone in the room they would appreciate it being low odour as well. This is going to be the thinner and also what you're going to use to clean the brush afterwards as well. And the tools I use just to accomplish this a bit easier, I've got a metal tin that I use to mix the paint and thinner in. I've also got a pipette just because it's easier to portion out the thinner that way, and I'm just using an old junky brush that doesn't matter. This is a natural hair brush, but honestly it could be synthetic, it really doesn't matter. So all I'm doing here is I'm just grabbing a bit of the black oil paint and popping it in the dish. You don't need much because it's quite a small model, but obviously if you're doing a whole batch painting you might want to mix up a bit of a larger amount. I'm then just popping the pipette into the thinner, grabbing a bit and squeezing a few drops into the dish, and then just mix together. I would advise adding the thinner slowly so you can control the thickness of the wash. And the thickness that you're aiming for is just enough thinner so that the wash can start moving freely in the dish. I know it's a bit dark and hard to see, but kind of something like this. And then it's just a case of liberally applying this all over the model. Don't worry if you think you're putting it on too thick. We are actually going to wait until this dries a bit and remove the majority of it anyway with some Q-tips, so go crazy. If this is your first time painting with oils, I thought I'd also go through the cleanup steps just in case you weren't sure. But all I do is pop the brush into the thinner and just give it a quick wash. You then just want to grab some spare tissue and just soak up all the paint that's left in the dish. You can't really pour this stuff down the drains here in the UK, so it's much easier just to absorb it into some tissue paper and pop it in the bin. So as alluded to earlier, it's Q-tip time. All you want to do is grab some of these Q-tips or cotton buds and just gently rub them over the model. In this instance, I've left the model about an hour or so after I've applied the oils. This way the majority of the white spirits evaporated, leaving just the oil residue on the model. Don't rub too hard when you're removing this. It's much better to do multiple light passes than a singular strong pass. There's a danger of removing the acrylic paint underneath if you're too aggressive with the removal. So the last time I showed this technique in a video and removed the oil with some cotton buds, I noticed a lot of people saying that they were getting a lot of errant stray hairs from the cotton buds sticking to the model. At the time I wasn't affected by it too much myself, but I definitely noticed it this time around with these brand of cotton buds. I would recommend buying a higher quality cotton bud with a bamboo stick in the middle. They seem to be a good indicator of a cotton bud that will shed a lot less. These cheap store-bought ones that I've got with the paper stick in the middle tend to be a lot worse for it. People also recommended some sponge makeup removers for this. I did buy some, but I noticed that they were picking up way too much oil and not leaving enough behind, almost like you didn't do the oil step at all. So I would still recommend the bamboo stick cotton buds. So if like me and you've now just finished picking 100 stray hairs off your mini, it's time to varnish. Here I'm going to use this Galleria matte varnish by Winsor & Newton. It's actually normally used for varnishing large canvas paintings, but you can use it diluted down a little bit in an airbrush absolutely fine. And because it comes in such a big pot, you're never going to run out. So if you are using this in an airbrush, just spray a thin layer over the model, wait for it to completely dry, and then maybe give it a second coat until you're happy with the finish. If you don't have an airbrush, instead you can just get some decent rattle can varnish sprays off Amazon or from Games Workshop themselves. They work absolutely fine as well. The idea is here we just want to make sure that the oil stays put and doesn't go anywhere. And once the varnishing is finished, that's us all done. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate all the support, and we've just hit 1,000 subscribers, so thank you again so much everyone. Hopefully this has been helpful and maybe you've learned a thing or two. I really hope that you pick up at least one new skill from any of these videos, even if it's something little or something quite big like oil washes. Anyway, thanks again guys, take care and I'll see you soon.